Imagine waking up to skyrocketing electricity prices not because you're using more energy, but because of tariffs on electricity that flows from neighboring countries. This is exactly what the US and Canada are facing amidst growing tensions in an escalating trade war. The Trump administration says Canada is taxing goods like dairy at over 200% from the US, and the Premier of Ontario is threatening to shut down all electricity exports to the US in response. So what's really happening, and what does it mean for us who ultimately bear the burden of the price? Let's figure this out together. I'm Ricky, and this is 2-Bit Da Vinci. This video is brought to you by Ground News. Let's start with the why and the history of tariffs here in the US. First and foremost, I want to say that tariffs are nothing new. They exist all around the world, pretty much between all countries, and they always have. I just think they're being more politicized now. But in the context of Canada and US relations, here's a little quick look. All the way back in 1968, they had the North American Electric Reliability Council. They realized early on just how important it was to have a very expansive and reliant grid. And we'll talk about that here in a second. Then there's the oil crisis, and that leads up to the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement in 1988. That was replaced by the North American Free Trade Agreement that included Mexico as well. And then you can see here in 2001, they created an energy working group. And then in 2009, the shale revolution turns the tides in production here in the US in terms of crude oil. And then fast forward to 2020, we have the new USMCA, which is the new United States, Mexico, and Canada trade agreement. But looking at the US and Canada, they have a bit of a love-hate history with trade barriers. Like I mentioned, the development of NAFTA led to the boom of $290 billion to over $1.1 trillion in cross-exchange in 2016. But not everything is tariff-free, and it never has been. For example, the claim about Canadian dairy is true. They do slap about a 200 to 300% tariff to shield farmers under their supply management systems. To understand why this is, let's look at the production of milk by country. India, I was surprised to learn, rules them all by an order of magnitude of 2 more than the US. But the US is number 2 at 100 million tons. If we scroll all the way down to 19th, we have Canada at about 9. So that means that the US produces over 10 times more dairy than Canada. And this leads to a concern that the US could flood the market with huge amounts of dairy, hurting the local ranchers and farmers in Canada. And this is exactly why countries apply tariffs, to protect themselves. It's a national interest play to ensure that your local industries are protected from perceived unfair practices in other countries. What's unfair about the US? Well, the US has nearly 10 times the population of Canada, and it has prime land, and it has incredible dairy industries like we just showed. This is going to make it very difficult for countries like Canada to compete. And the reality is, if the US could export dairy to the Canadians, it would definitely hurt their local industries. But this isn't a one-way street. The US also imposes tariffs on Canada. For example, softwood lumber is tariffed at 20% as of 2017. Now, the rationale here is that a lot of the logging that happens in Canada is on Crown land, meaning it's government-owned, and it might be potentially partially subsidized, leading to a better price than what the Americans could provide. Here's a list of the top lumber exporters. And as you can see, Canada is number 1. If you've ever seen a map of Canada, just look at how much of the US is kind of arid and barren. But if you look at the northern parts of Canada, it is nearly entirely wooded. So they have just tons and tons of forests. So yeah, Canada surprisingly is number 1. Germany is number 2. I didn't realize how high Germany was. And the US is no slouch either. And this is what the US is trying to protect. They're trying to protect their forestry industry because the perceived threat that the Canadians could outcompete them due to unfair practices. This is at the heart of what's happening, and it's been going on for a long time. So even though the countries share a free trade agreement, there are exceptions. And I don't think that's fundamentally a bad thing, because ultimately every country's government is responsible for the welfare of their people. And if they believe that there is an industry that might be unfairly competed against, they're going to protect it. Researching these videos and finding good information isn't so straightforward. In a recent video I made about the DC plane mishap, I was shocked at how differently the same story was covered depending on the political lean of the publication. But check this out. This is Ground News, a resource I've been using for over 2 years. In these headlines, left-leaning publications use words like blame, saying Trump tries to freeze federal funding and blames others for plane collision, while right-leaning publications use headlines that read, Former Biden FAA boss doesn't dispute Trump's hiring claims. This is leading language, and it colors everything that follows. Another tactic is omission, choosing what parts of a story to cover and what parts to leave out. But Ground News gathers related articles from around the world in one place, shares who owns each publication, its left or right bias, and even the historical factuality. I love Blind Spot, a curated section showing stories with little to no reporting from one side or the other. It really helps you see what's getting people on both sides riled up. Ground News is mission critical here at Tuba Da Vinci, and a yearly subscription is an absolute bargain, and it's ad-free. So whether you're browsing on the web or your phone, if you want to see every side of every news story, you have to check out Ground News. Use our links in the description and get 40% off of a Vantage plan and get started today. Huge thanks to Ground News and you. Now back to the show. Now let's switch gears and talk about energy. Canada is a power giant. They benefit from one of the largest sources of hydroelectric power on Earth. In fact, over 60% of their electricity comes from hydroelectric power. Nuclear is another 15%. That means 75% wind. Over 80% of Canadian energy is completely carbon-free, which is pretty amazing, and this is what makes them such a viable trade partner for electricity. This is a map showing US and Canada's energy trade. Obviously goes both directions, and you can see these points where the interchanges happen. And now in this particular map, when you talk about the amounts of money here, for example, Alberta, 56 billion, that includes oil and natural gas as well, so we're not going to look at that directly. But if you just look at the import-export, you can see that the Canadians send more electricity to the US in every quadrant. And this is true especially to areas like New York, Michigan, Vermont, Maine, where most of their energy is actually coming from clean Canadian sources. And if a 10% tariff were to be introduced, that would substantially increase prices for Americans near the border of Canada, where most of this energy is used. But we have an interconnected system here for electricity. Here's a map of the U.S. electricity grids and how they're connected. You can see all the interconnects here. ERCOT is the most isolated with only one connection to the Southwest Power Pool, but the rest of them have large levels of interconnections. And this is what gives energy its resiliency, because it's really hard to know how the demand and generation is going to vary during the day, especially as more renewables come online. Check this out. Here is a little animation, and you can see as the day begins on the East Coast, it starts lighting up red, and then as the day goes on, that demand shifts westward until later in the day. Now, this is what makes it difficult to manage electricity. Unlike natural gas and water, which can be pumped into reservoirs and under pressure and held for when it's needed, electricity has to be created and used pretty much in real time. And that is a hard challenge. If suddenly there's a lot of cloud cover and solar generation in the Mojave Desert starts to go downward, we need to be able to offset that elsewhere. And that's where interconnectivity really comes through. And looking back at this map, you can see the interconnects here with the Canadian sources like BC Hydro up here, Alberta Electric Systems, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and all these interconnects. And the more points that you have of interconnectivity, the more customers you can potentially send energy to, and the more producers you can take energy from. And this is what really, I think, is at the heart of why this trade war matters, because the grid stability is going to be potentially strained here if anything were to happen. The good news is, as of March 13th, so far, the Trump administration and Canadians have walked back all their proposed tariffs on electricity, so there's nothing at play currently. But that, of course, could always change. Now, a lot of the tariff proposals are in the interest of fairness, like it's unfair that U.S. dairy is taxed so high or Canadian lumber is taxed so high. And so in the interest of fairness, what would electricity tariffs look like? But the reality is the US has the larger population, and Canada is really blessed with hydroelectric power. Just from rain, rivers, and snowmelt, Canadians have a large supply of hydroelectric power. And in fact, they probably have more than they need. And so without this customer, the US, a large population base, they would hurt. Also, the same is true for the US. The US can then buy really affordable, cheap, clean energy. If you've ever wondered why states like Washington, Oregon, all the coastal states near Canada have such cheap electricity, this is partly why. And why electricity in California, which is much further away and we get much less from Canada, is much more expensive. The reality is, when it comes to electricity, it just has to be viewed differently than other goods and services that get tariffed, like crude oil or coal, because electricity is such a real-time phenomenon. If you have electricity and there's no one who needs it, you can't really bank it. Now, of course, batteries are coming online, but it's going to take a while. And that kind of gets to the other question. If the idea behind a tariff is to make something non-profitable and incentivize people to build more power plants, for example, here in the US, there's a long lead time for that. If you want to make more clean energy sources, it could potentially be a while. A new power plant could take 20 years to build. Solar farms can take multiple years, including regulatory approvals and everything else. And that's the game that we have to be very concerned with, because if there's any power instability or brownouts, that infects the GDP of both countries dramatically. There's very little that anyone can do without electricity. Pretty much every industry would come to a screeching halt. So when you look at a picture like this, and you look at the import versus export graphs, you'll notice that pretty much the Canadian side is bigger in every state. So we import more energy from Canada than we do send it to Canada. But that's not really a question of fairness, because if we have the population and they have the resources, that's the nature of trade. So free trade agreements are great, and I think we should definitely be looking to have more of them in place, but ultimately there's going to be unfairness if you look at individual sectors. But if you zoom back and look at it from like a 30,000 foot perspective, that's probably the better way to do it. So while the idea of symmetric tariffs, meaning if you tariff our goods, we'll do the exact same percentage for your goods, sounds like a good idea, I think it misses the fact that every country is blessed in different ways. They have forests, we have dairy, right? China has graphite, whatever the case might be. Different countries have different goods, so they should be viewed in different terms. By the way, all the energy that we've been talking about so far has been electricity, but that's not the half of it. If you look at these graphs, only this little light blue is electricity. These big bars are crude oil and refined petroleum, and it dominates the airwaves. Here's the thing. The U.S. actually exports a lot of the oil that it drills in America. For example, the Permian Basin, where we do the fracking to get sweeter crude oil, we actually export. And then we turn around and we buy crude oil from Canada. So that could also potentially be impacted here. It's really nice to have good neighbors and to have good relations. You got to remember that the Canadians send forces to help us fight fires, for example. The Canadians flew fighter jets during 9/11 to help us. I mean, being good neighbors is always the right thing. And for all of our Canadian viewers, I love you. I absolutely adore Canada. I've been there many times. We'll be back for the Everything Electric show in Vancouver. But oil and gas exports are a huge part of this story. And to understand fully why the U.S. can't actually use the oil that it drills and it has to go out and buy it from largely Canada, check out this video next.